All right. Welcome to another episode of Seize the Moment podcast. And today it's just us, Alen and Leon here. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of boundary setting, having boundaries for yourself, in your relationships, with friends, work, you name it. So to start off, I'll talk about what boundaries are essentially. So um, boundaries are what you allow, essentially, for yourself and from other people, in terms of how you expect them to treat you, how you expect to sort of treat yourself, and that kind of thing. Having boundaries is crucial to the well-being of your relationships with yourself and others, essentially.
Mhm.
And if somebody had no boundaries, generally speaking, that can lead to drama, passive aggressive behavior, people pleasing behavior if you have no boundaries, disrespect, etc. And it's really important to sort of set limitations on what's okay for and what's not okay, and to have that to be clearly defined. Um,
Well,
what are your thoughts on boundaries?
I was actually just going to ask you the
Yeah.
question. Okay. Okay. So actually, I actually want to start off and ask you the question, right? Because I think it's going to get the ball rolling here on a dialogue. So why do you think that people find it so hard to set boundaries with others?
So they're really afraid of being judged. They're afraid of the other person's reaction to them. Um, they're afraid to just speak up. It might not be part of their personality. They'd rather sort of be told what their boundaries are, or just
Hmm.
automatically expect people to know what their boundaries are.
Right.
Um, I was going to actually jump into this a bit later, but I guess I could give an example. Imagine, um, you're with a significant other, and all of a sudden you say something. I'm being general here, but you say something, and it's something that they didn't like. But
Hmm.
instead of speaking up and telling you like that's not okay what you just said, they may give you silent treatment or passive aggressive treatment,
Hmm.
expecting you to sort of know like you just crossed my boundary. But a lot of times people will cross other people's boundaries without even knowing it, which is why it's important that you let them know what your boundaries are, so this way you don't create these mm, feedback loop interactions. Like imagine a scenario where I did something and you started giving me the silent treatment instead of telling
Hmm.
me what I did.
Right.
All of a sudden, you were coming off passive aggressive to me. Me
Hmm.
not knowing why you're passive aggressive now creates in me a reaction of being like, why are you being passive aggressive? Like, what the hell? And why can't you explain to me what's going on?
Hmm.
And then my own reaction at that point is then going to lead you to either be continuously passive aggressive or still not necessarily reveal what your boundary is. And
Right.
then maybe we'll get into some sort of argument or a tiff, or won't continue the dialogue chain. And it can lead to all sorts of like messed up places when people don't know what your boundaries are, essentially. And then there's
Hmm.
different kinds of boundaries, right? Emotional boundaries, physical boundaries, material boundaries, time boundaries, right? And I guess we'll just leave it at that for now, just to be general. But like, for
Okay.
example, um, let's say time, right? So generally speaking, if somebody has a 9 to 5 job, right, their time is clearly defined what time they're working, right? So they know from this time to this time I am working, and
Right.
then anytime after that I may be free, or something like that. So that's a somewhat easily defined sort of time boundary. So
Right.
maybe while you're working, you don't want to be bothered by someone else. Maybe you don't want to get calls from your family while you're working. Maybe
Hmm.
that's your boundary. Like you set a boundary, like, please, during this time to this time, I'm doing something. I can speak before it or after it, something like that.
Right. Right.
But if somebody, let's say, has their own business, right, or is an entrepreneur, they they might not have a clearly set defined time schedule. Some people make the mistake of, because they don't have a set time schedule, I'll work whenever I feel like it. They go by feeling,
Right.
so
Right.
their boundaries aren't clearly defined. Therefore, they might experience things like sometimes when you're working, you want to be relaxing, and then sometimes when you're relaxing, you think you should be working. Like you don't deserve to relax because you need to be working.
Right.
But then having a set sort of schedule or a boundary essentially for yourself in terms of your time
Mhm.
won't let you get to that point where you're sort of half in, half out. I should be doing this when I'm doing this. I should be doing that, you know?
All right. But
Um,
what do you want to focus on first? Do you want to talk about like self boundaries, or do you want to talk about the boundaries we should set with other people?
yeah, we can go whichever way. Like, what are your thoughts so far, for example, when I'm
Yeah.
mentioning like these
Well,
different
yeah,
kinds of boundaries?
I'm actually thinking of so Rich Roll. I don't know if you saw, was on Tim Ferriss this past week, so it was a pretty good podcast, right? So they were talking about how like mood, what was it, that action dictates mood, right? And sometimes obviously it's the other way around too. It's not just it's not just one rather than the other. So
Mhm.
what happens is when you do things that you don't want to do. So let's talk about the self kind of boundaries that we would have. So what you would do is you would do something that you would, let's say, not normally want to do, something, let's say, that doesn't make you feel good in the moment, like, I don't know, working out, writing, doing a podcast when you don't feel like it, right? And it's like, so a lot of times what we do is we kind of wait for the mood first, right, to kind of spur action, right? And we're like, oh, when we feel like it, we're going to end up doing, whatever it is that we want to do. So it's like, oh, I don't feel like going to work, or I don't feel like working out, or I don't feel like writing today, right? But it seems like what the sort of geniuses of the world, right, and it could even be athletes too, especially like with Rich Roll in this case, what they know is it actually doesn't fucking matter what your mood is, right? If you have something to do, you go and do it. So why? You do it because of the repetition, right? That's important because you're perfecting your craft. But on top of that, you also do it because it actually makes you feel better once it's done, right? So if you have a great workout, obviously you feel much better after the workout is done. If you, let's say, write, I don't know, a blog, right? Even if it might not be the best blog in the world because you weren't feeling like doing it in the first place, you still
Mhm.
feel better having done it. If, let's say, you're training for something like a marathon, that really sucks because there's not really much, short-term glory there, but you know that you're kind of getting prepped and gearing up for this, like, let's say whatever it is, a 5K or whatever it is you're running, right? This kind of like ultra marathon, as opposed to your training. So what I think people tend to do is, and this is like natural. I mean, this is a problem that I have too. If we don't feel like doing something, we kind of like tell ourselves, whatever, I'll do this some other day, right? I'll do it when I'm feeling better. But you kind of find out in life that a lot of times you're not feeling better, especially if you aren't doing anything. And
That's
so,
true.
yeah, and I mean, I would even tie this into Rachel's office, who was on the podcast like a couple of months ago, and she has the same idea with pain management. She's like, when if you don't do it progressively, right, and you're always in pain, you're just not going to do it, right? So the thing is like, oh, I don't want to be in pain, so I'm going to wait till I'm not in pain to go out to exercise, to hang out with my friends, let's say to do my schoolwork, whatever it is. And she's like, no, that's never going to happen, right? Because if you're not actually treating the pain, the chronic pain, what's going to happen is you're just going to be, you're always going to be in pain, and you're never going to get yourself to do the thing that you want to do. So my point here is to say that a lot of times people think, well, it's action that dictates mood, but it's also vice versa. I'm sorry, that it's mood that dictates action, but it's also vice versa. Action also dictates mood.
Oh yeah, for sure. Like, a sort of as a side tangent, if let's say all day you're laying down,
Yeah.
you're sedentary. I mean, imagine what kind of mood or what kind of state you'd be
Right.
in that sort of case. How could you then develop the mood to go work out?
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, I suppose there, every general, example is going to have counter examples,
Yeah.
but yeah, you generally have to take the action first, and then sort of your mood will follow. And even if your mood doesn't follow, sometimes, I mean, sometimes you have to do what you have to do, essentially.
Yeah.
Otherwise, that you can't wait for something to happen in order to, take action sometimes. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
but a lot of
Because
times your mood does follow.
and you know why, right? Because so a lot of times nothing does happen. So it's like unless you go
Yeah.
out there and make it happen, it's like if you're passive about it, most of the time, man. And this is maybe one of the shittiest facts of life. Good things don't necessarily happen to us a lot of the times. I mean, it's nice when it does, right? But it's not that common.
I mean, I'll tell you this. I've definitely been in cases before where, let's say back in my college days, yeah, if I would actually do things subject to my mood. Like, I would think,
Mhm.
all right, after I come back from college, I shouldn't probably do my homework yet or study for that test yet. Let me relax first. All
Mhm.
right, I relax. Great. Now I feel more relaxed. Now I feel like I don't want to do more after
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Then I'd say to myself, all right, well, you still have to do that thing. I don't feel like it. It's actually not even due tomorrow. It's the test is on Friday. Today's Wednesday. All right, I'll study tomorrow. And then I might follow the same pattern. Like, I'll come back from college, be be like, oh, let me relax right away, and
Right, right.
have a weird systems. Like I didn't have, it was sort of subject to just how I feel, and
Hmm.
my boundaries essentially were very wishy-washy. I
Right.
went by feeling, which
Yep.
is, sometimes you could rely on your feelings. Sometimes your body does let you know it's time to take action, and you really
Yep.
can follow your gut instinct and all of that. But to rely on it is, yeah, it's not a great idea in my
Yeah, and it
opinion.
becomes self-defeating if that's all you're doing. Because if we're talking about progress, I can imagine a world where it's like, I want to be a better whatever it is, right? And you're only doing, the practice based on some sort of feeling. And let's say you're not doing it enough, you're not going to get better, right? You're not going to develop muscles if it's working out. You're not going to, kind of hone your writing ability if it's writing. Because the
Yeah.
thing is, if you're not actually practicing your craft, you're not getting better at it. So if let's say, I don't know, on average, you're only like writing once every 3 weeks or something like that, when you feel like it, right? The chances of you becoming a great writer are pretty slim.
No, for sure. Yeah. And even so, that's sort of like, how should I put this? Like, so there's different sorts of boundaries, right? For example, we were just discussing time and sort of time, for in terms of your relationship to yourself, right? And then these side tangents. But what about with other people, right?
Mhm.
For example, let's say you have a meeting. Let's say you, for example, I was thinking about this before this podcast, actually, as an example.
Mhm.
If you have a client that you're going to meet for an appointment, and
Mhm.
you might have a client a little bit later in the day, I mean, how much lateness could you tolerate from a client, and before you have to say, okay,
Oh, I, I
no,
I
we're
actually have a
canceling the session?
I actually have a technical answer for this because we have rules for this, right? So for insurance companies, if the session is under 37 minutes, you are not legally allowed to bill for it. And
Mm,
contractually, you're not allowed to bill for it. Yeah. So they can actually miss about whatever it is, 7 minutes, right? Let's say if a minute, yeah. So if it's 45 minutes, so yeah, no, I'm sorry. So if it's 45 minutes, what is that, 30, yeah, 7 minutes, so 7 8 minutes, right? So they're allowed to miss. So if you're late 7 8 minutes, I don't give a shit, right? I could still bill for the session. But yeah, so if it's under 37 minutes, I am legally not allowed, and again, contractually not allowed to bill for the session. So that's actually pretty cool for me because like so for my other clients, the ones who like pay out of pocket, I'm like,
mm.
listen, if you want to come in for a 10 to 15 minute session, you can do whatever you want, that's fine, right? But yeah, if for the people who are under insurance, they actually can't do that, so automatically there's a fine.
Well, all right. So there you go. So even your work sort of, there's boundaries automatically set,
Automatically,
right?
yeah. Yeah, from the contract, right.
All right. So let's forget clients for a second. Although that is a clearly defined boundary, and that's
Yeah.
good to have something like that. Let's say with friends, how much lateness could you tolerate from a friend? Imagine you're
Ooh,
supposed to meet
I love that.
somewhere, like, oh, we're supposed to meet at 2, like,
Hmm.
and it's and we're all gonna meet for dinner. It's like 4 people coming,
Yep.
and one person, no, 2 people are late. One person's 30 minutes late. Another person is an hour late,
Hmm.
right? How, like, would you tolerate that, or would you sort of let somebody know, like, hey, you crossed a boundary here, like you're late, that's
Yep.
not cool?
Yeah, yeah. So, okay, great question. So it depends on the context. So first, you have obviously asked the person like what's going on with them, right? If they tell you like, oh, hey, I just lost track of time or whatever. So let's say this is what I normally do with people, and I think we had this issue recently, right, when we all kind of went out as a group. So my whole thing is like, if the person isn't there by a certain amount of time, then now making decisions without you, right? So it's not that you're not allowed to come. You can come and you can come hang out or whatever, right? But now you are no longer a part of the decision making process. It depends on what the issue is, right? So if a person does this chronically and you kind of expect that they're gonna either ghost you for a little bit or they're not gonna come back, I'm sorry, not gonna come around for X amount of time, or they're gonna be late for X amount of time, then my whole thinking is like, don't depend on those people. Like literally, and I'm not saying cut them off completely, but let them know, hey, you know what? So look, I see that you struggle with time management. I'm not gonna be upset with you. However, right, if you're not here by this particular time, we're gonna do something else. We're gonna make other plans, or we're just going to make plans without you. So if, let's say if it's dinner, then, I'm not waiting for anybody for 30 minutes to eat. So again, unless something serious happened, right? So my whole
Yeah.
thing is like, I guess we're eating without you. If you want, you could come for dessert or whatever it is. I mean, what do I care, if you're coming to hang out anyway. But yeah, so the whole thing is like, there have to be consequences, but I don't think that they have to be so harsh where you're like cutting the person off and saying, oh, I'm never making any plans with you. No, my thinking is, it's like, oh, okay, you don't want to be responsible, which is absolutely okay, right? Now we're going to take the responsibility as a group away from you.
Yeah. Plus, if I had to answer honestly, from my perspective, yeah,
Mhm.
if somebody's late once, I mean, it's okay. I could tolerate it, right? I mean, I think it's okay to allow somebody to be late once or something like that. But yeah, if it's something that you could tell is that's like that person's consistently late,
Right.
then yeah, I'd have to really draw a boundary. Be like, hey man, you can't be coming late constantly. Like we keep setting a time to meet at this time, and you keep choosing these different times, and it's very uncomfortable for me. Because otherwise, if I didn't make that clear,
Mhm.
then maybe I'll become passive aggressive, hoping they notice that
Yeah,
how
yeah,
it's affecting me, or I'll be just a doormat, right?
yeah, yeah.
And
Somebody.
and sorry, this is important. I wish I said
For
this
sure.
sort of at the beginning of the
For sure.
podcast, but that's
Mhm.
fine. So, boundary like having boundaries and self worth kind of go hand in hand, right? For example, knowing who you are and what you want it's like a sign of self respect, essentially.
Mhm.
And anytime you let somebody walk over your boundaries, essentially, not anytime, but basically, if you don't sort of make them clear, you
Mhm.
become, yeah, a doormat. You become this like sort of loose
Yeah.
boundary having person, uh, and people will take advantage. And you don't want that. And if you know the importance of setting boundaries and know what kind of effect it can have, like it could have potentially net positive effects. Because again, if most people don't know when they're crossing a boundary with you
Mhm.
and you let them know when they are,
Right.
chances are, especially if it's your friend, chances are they're going to respect it.
Mhm.
I mean, I guess it depends what it is, but generally speaking, a lot of times disagreements happen, or arguments, or just like sort of bad vibes in relationship is
Right.
because people aren't saying
Yeah.
or clearly communicating what they're feeling in a particular given context or interaction.
Right, right, right. And I would like to define it as like there's a difference between being liked and respected. So when you're liked, the person gets some sort of emotional benefit from you, right? So meaning that like there's a sort of net positive, right? In terms, well, maybe not a net positive, but there's at least a one-sided positive, right, from an interaction with you. Meaning that for whatever reason, right, you just make them feel good or you make them happier, which is great, right? But when you're respected, that means they also care about you gaining the same as they do in return, right? So if a person respects you and they hold you in high regard, they don't view you as like their servant, right? They don't view you as somebody who's just there to please them and make them happy. Pretty much somebody who's subordinate to them in some sort of way, right? So a lot of times what happens is people settle for being liked as opposed to being respected. And I like that you brought up self-esteem, because the idea there is that if I don't have enough self-esteem, you know what? I'll just settle for being liked.
You know what though? You really A lot of people who sort of think that by having loose boundaries and letting people do what they want,
Mhm.
you know, having that sort of people pleaser mindset,
Yeah.
uh, there's actually, I would say, counterintuitively, if somebody did have respect for themselves, they would be more liked than
Mhm.
than
Yeah.
if they just allow the other person to do as they please, and it's like,
Well,
this
can we
illusion of being easygoing.
just add nuance to that? They would be liked and respected by the right people.
Oh, so I did want to get into this later,
Okay.
but I guess I'll bring it up now. So yeah, generally speaking, yeah, setting boundaries can be very polarizing,
Right.
right? Um, but that's a good thing. It's a very good thing because, for example, I didn't get into like some of the other kinds of boundaries, but let's say like a physical boundary,
Mhm.
right? Like somebody spits on you, which is a little extreme, but somebody spits on you, right? I mean, that's that's something where, like, if you allow that, that's pretty messed up. That's pretty fucked up, right? But
To
like,
say the least, yeah.
yeah, essentially. But when you don't, right? Okay, maybe that person spit on you, and now you're not going to interact with them ever again. Because,
Right.
but that's an asshole. Like, why are they spitting on you, right? It
Mhm.
might not even be your friend. It could be a random person. But
Right.
because you set that boundary, and you will, you're like, that's it, we're not going to interact anymore. Okay, great. That person's not in your life anymore. You don't, it's like a person who doesn't share the same values as you is not around you anymore, which can only be a net positive if your values are quote unquote healthy, which is subjective, whatever. But why I'm saying it like that is because imagine, that person who's the asshole sets boundaries against nice people and only interacts with their assholes. I'm just imagining that scenario, right? And I guess, I guess you'd be attracting the right person for your values, but it's not necessarily great values, but whatever.
Yeah, I guess, sure.
Yeah. But again, back to the main point is, it's extremely polarizing to set boundaries. And that's why a lot of people are afraid to be judged or to let someone else know. Like, for example, say someone is making a joke at your expense, right? And I've definitely had this a lot. And then there's different ways to sort of take it. Like if you're being, good old boy, right? You're going along with the interaction and you're not getting offended because, it's your friends joking and stuff like that. It's not meant to be serious. And like what a joke is, then it's okay that they said that, even if it's like, even if objectively it could be something that sounds kind of insulting, but you know that it's a joke, they don't mean it, then of course you kind of let that fly. But imagine somebody did that and they think they're doing like a funny joke and actually kind of hurt, like, oh shit, that was a little extreme what you just said, actually. But then somebody might be afraid in that interaction, especially if it's in a group setting, to let you know, hey, you crossed my boundary, right? Although you're not going to expressly say it like that, that'd be a little lame, right? But because you're afraid to kill the flow of the interaction. Everyone's laughing, having a good time. You don't want to let them know they insulted you. But maybe you should, if it's like actually something that's legitimately insulting. This way, you don't let that sort of behavior fly in the future. But that one's a little more nuanced and a little more delicate of a situation.
What makes it so hard is because like sometimes jokes are just jokes, So I guess
that's the thing.
Yeah, you have to like really negotiate with the person and figure out like what's okay and what isn't. So there's like no clear cut answer to that. Like what? So I mean, I guess the answer is intention, but then you don't really know what a person's intention really is, right? I mean, I guess you can tell by the tone of their voice and what they're actually saying. So look, some things are definitely more obviously offensive than others, but yes, I mean, people are also touchy on the other end too. Sometimes things really aren't that offensive.
Right. So imagine that person who took offense, right? Set that boundary. And now the person who you told that to, let's say you're afraid to tell that person, like, hey, that joke was like, I get it, like you're trying to be funny, but that's a little too much. Like, let's not do jokes like that anymore. It depends. Like, you might have a fear to say that, because what if then you're afraid of the other person thinking like, oh man, this guy can't take a joke. And you just ruined the vibe, and like we're all joking here and this guy's all serious and all of that, and like I thought you had enough emotional intelligence to realize this is a joke or something.
Which is honestly, and it could be argued that that's gaslighting, because narcissists do that shit all the time, right?
So people, so people are right. So people are afraid to be gaslit too,
right?
Right. You don't want to be told that your version of reality is wrong. You're wrong for thinking what you're thinking. So you just kind of let it go. You avoid any conflict, any discomfort. But avoiding conflict and discomfort and all of that, it's not like, sure, there's a time and place maybe to avoid conflict, generally speaking. But to always be like that, again, it's not you won't be respected all the way. I mean, it's very general speak, but
no, I hear you. But just to go back to that self-esteem thing, right? I mean, there's like a lot there. And so what's so hard sometimes, and I mean, I know people like this personally, not just clients, but just friends, family, whatever, right? Well, you'll have a person, and this is so hard to watch, where like they'll know that somebody wronged them, but because they're so desperate to get everyone, like literally everyone, to like them, they're actually going to still try to win that person over, right? And then you'll tell them, you'll be like, wait, but you're clearly right here, right? Like you did nothing wrong, right? This person is clearly exaggerating and overreacting. And then still that person is so desperate for love and affection that they will just be like, no, I will try to make it up to this person. Like, I still believe that they're reasonable enough to actually make this somehow work. And you're like, okay, I mean, you're going to keep trying and it's not going to go anywhere.
And that's the thing also, right? Like maybe having a boundary against like what kind of people do you want in your
Right.
life, right? Do you want people who you're sort of chasing after for their approval?
Some people
Or do you
want
want
that.
people? Yeah, but you know, what's the value in that? Because I've heard this
Dopamine.
before. No, right, but
Yeah.
essentially speaking, like this might sound like counterintuitive, but I've heard this before. Like, why would you sell something? Like, essentially, why would you sell yourself to someone who doesn't want you,
Yeah.
want the product, right?
Right.
Why wouldn't you just sell to someone who does, right?
But,
Then,
but remember, this person actually believes that they can win the other person over.
yeah, but it's foolhardy
Oh
because
yeah, yeah.
yeah, I mean, all right, fine, that's fine that they believe it. I mean, yeah, people believe
Yeah,
all sorts of things,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But
because it's like you personalize it and you tell yourself, okay, so I did something wrong or I'm not good enough. So if I continue to work on it and I continue to work on myself, I could eventually become good enough for this person. Sad, man.
well,
It sucks. It's
what sucks
well,
is there's a sense to it too. There is some
right.
sense to it.
Yeah,
It
well,
sounds
yeah,
like a
true,
good
yeah, true.
rationalization.
Yeah, yeah, very true. Yeah, one of my clients that I saw yesterday, she told me that her sister went back to like her abusive ex, and in my mind, I'm like, yeah, I mean, who didn't see this coming? And she's like, yo, it just fucking sucks, man. Like, no matter what you say to her, she just keeps going back to this guy. And they had like this kind of big blowout like breakup where like she even brought like a friend over because oh yeah, by the way, and this guy's like choked her before, and then so like yeah, so she brought a friend over because she thought that he was going to get violent. And she's like, okay, I'm taking all my stuff and leaving, right? It seemed like the end. And literally, yo, like 3 weeks later, she just hits him up again. Yeah.
So that would be the importance of maybe having sort of an emotional boundary,
Yeah,
right?
very true.
Like, what
Yeah.
sort of emotions do you want to allow yourself, not to allow yourself to feel essentially, but what sort of emotional spaces do you want to occupy,
Hmm.
right? Do you want to be around this person who causes you so much stress and makes you cry all the time, or physically abuses you, which also could be a physical boundary, like you
Yeah.
don't touch me, like that's
Yeah.
not the right way to touch me and stuff like that.
Hmm.
um but there's other things going on there in that particular example that you're giving.
Hmm.
um there's a lot of angles to really hit it from in terms of what's still exciting about that guy
Well,
to her.
you have sunk costs, right? So she doesn't. So she tells her she doesn't want to leave the investment. She's like, I've already lost so much time, and I don't want to just like let it go. Then there's also the belief that she's going to be alone, meaning that this is as good as it gets for her. And then so if she ever leaves this guy, there's not going to be anybody around. Like it's just going to be her for the rest of her life. And then yeah, I mean, there's also the thrill, like the dopamine rush of getting this guy back, right? So he be like, they ended their relationship, and she's like, oh my god, he doesn't want me anymore, but now he does want me again, right? And it's like that seesaw of emotions, that roller coaster, and that's exciting too. And there's probably even more facets of it, obviously.
So I'm with you. That's the thing. There's a lot of factors that sort of
Right.
go into that particular situation.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm going to switch to something a little more general.
Shoot.
For example, just so in the space of sort of having emotional boundaries, that this can mean a lot of different things. Like, who do you share what emotions with?
Hmm.
Like, will you tell your secrets to your boss?
Right.
Probably not a good idea, right?
Hmm.
Will you tell everyone everything about
Hmm.
you? Also maybe not a good idea.
Right.
It sounds interesting. Like, from one level, somebody might argue like, well, you're being honest and very expressive. How do you know that's not a good thing? Well, I'll welcome that, if somebody had that, and then have a discussion around that, no problem.
Right. Right.
But yeah, there's things like that. There is who do you allow yourself to be vulnerable with,
Hmm.
right? um maybe you don't want to be vulnerable with the wrong person, because
Hmm.
maybe they're not gonna um give you the same kind of vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
Like, just because you're vulnerable with anybody doesn't mean that you're going to get that same amount of vulnerability back. Or what about trust? Like, who can
Right.
you trust with certain secrets? Or
Hmm.
like, should you tell should you tell your parents, for example, all the crazy things you've ever done? Maybe. It depends what those crazy things are. But generally speaking, maybe no. Maybe you don't have to necessarily give out all of your information, right? Maybe also, at what point do you decide to be vulnerable with somebody? Let's say with a significant other. Like maybe you don't want to be entirely vulnerable right away. You're just giving up everything right away to somebody who you don't know so well yet. Maybe it's not a great idea. Also, what do you do when someone betrays your trust? Do you let them know they crossed the boundary?
It depends, by the way. Again, it depends. It depends on who the person is to you. So if like you're dating that person, you can even ghost them. I mean, that makes sense because you don't know them that well.
Sure. So let me ask you this. Maybe I'll switch it to something more specific. Say you told me, maybe not me.
Okay, you.
Fine, me. Let's do it just for the sake of moving things forward. Let's say you told me a secret, like a really big secret that essentially you actually made it clear you didn't want that to be told to anyone, and I told everyone essentially.
Put it on Facebook.
How would you react? I put it on Instagram. I put it on the Seize the Moment podcast, and I put your ultimate secret, for everybody to see.
Yeah,
and tag Leon's existential FK.
So to be honest with you, and I think this speaks to my low emotional EQ, I would just probably cut you off right away. I don't even think I give you like the benefit of the doubt or give you a conversation. I just cut you off.
Now, what if hypothetically I was mind controlled and I had to tell, no, I'm kidding. No, that's a joke. But
you're in a simulation. You're in a simulation, and we should talk about panpsychism.
Oh, totally. No, so but that's right? Like somebody betrays your trust, especially with like a really big secret you told not somebody to tell. I mean, it's important to let them know like they're crossing a boundary, right? Like you can't do that, right? It's not something that I allow, right? Also, maybe another part of an emotional boundary, just to switch it up again, because it's just like little examples. We don't have to like stay on one too long, but let's say how much affection you want from other people in terms of boundary. Like, do you want a lot of affection, or maybe you don't like too much affection? Like maybe you don't want someone who's so it's sort of back to a relationship sort of example, but let's say somebody who's needy, right? Quote unquote needy. That's too much affection, right? And then combine that with time. How much time of the day do you want to interact with that emotionally significant other, right? And then how much do you want to spend doing other things? Because that also needs to be defined. If it's something that's wishy-washy and you kind of go with the flow, there's just going to be a lot of sort of symptoms of that. In again, back to like what I mentioned before, like passive aggressiveness, drama, resentment, right? Like maybe you'll resent your significant other for trying to spend so much time with you and not letting you do these other things you want to do. Or maybe you'll resent yourself for not speaking up, right? And then that can lead to all sorts of problems, because then any emotions, thoughts, actions, anything like that will come from this sort of filter of resentment and drama, and lead you down all these pathways that may not necessarily you don't need to go down if you define the things in your own life. Like for example, I didn't get to this other one, so I guess I'll mention it first. So there's also like material boundaries, right? Like let's say someone breaks one of your belongings, right? Or not, or like maybe you don't want to let them borrow this thing. Like no, I that's not something I let somebody borrow. Or my car, no, I'm not giving my car to anyone. I understand like your situation that you need it for some reason, but also how somebody handles it when they cross a boundary. Like if, for example, I let somebody borrow my I don't have a PS5. If anyone's listening and wants to get me a no, I'm just kidding. But if I had a PS5, right, and someone borrowed it, let's say, and then it comes back, it's broken.
Mhm.
Like, what the hell? Not one, it's so hard to get one even now.
Right, right.
Two, like, come on, man, that's really messed up. Like,
Mhm.
I let you borrow this thing, you couldn't have taken care of it. Like, maybe if you'd let me borrow something, imagine how you would feel if I broke it, or something like that.
Right, right.
And a lot of this might, by the way, to the listener, might sound sort of like common sense. On one level, sure, it is, but the reason why us talking about this is so important is because a lot of people let their life go on automatic, right?
Mhm.
For example, again, they go kind of with what they feel. Like, a lot of people have a general idea of what their boundaries are, what they allow and don't allow, but they don't really ever, like, most people don't take the time to audit their life.
Mhm.
Like, where in my life am I letting people get away with things that I should be speaking up?
Right.
Where in my life am I too rigid?
Mhm.
And where am I like really rigid about my boundaries? Like, for example, I was also going to get into this later, but no problem, we'll get into it now. So, for example, there's different sorts of boundaries
Mhm.
somebody can have. They can have rigid boundaries, they can have loose boundaries, right? Or they can have let's call it a healthy boundary, like somewhere in
Right.
the middle.
Mhm.
So what's an example? Let's start with loose, let's say, just for fun.
Mhm.
So um I told you a secret and you ended up telling everyone,
Mhm.
right? And you know what? I like our relationship, I like the podcast, I like everything. I don't want to all of a sudden express my real emotion of complete anger, and like, that it's not cool that you said this secret, and instead I let it go,
Mhm.
right? Well, what that's a very people pleasery, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And sure, from one
I love the
perspective,
term people pleasery.
yeah,
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 I love
people
it.
pleasing,
We
yeah,
gotta coin that.
yeah. And so and yeah, sure, like, I might rationalize from the loose boundary standpoint,
Mhm.
like, no, I'm not resisting, I'm not reacting,
Yeah.
you know I'm going with the flow, I'm accepting this moment,
Mhm.
right? And I also I want the piece of the podcast and my relationship with him and with all our friends to be good, so I'm not going to say anything,
Mhm.
right? And where could that lead, right? Maybe towards resentment. Maybe I'll be passive aggressive towards you, like, not fully aggressive, but I'll be
Right.
like, hey, like, I expect you to know that that wasn't cool, right?
Right.
Kind of like how we discussed a bit earlier.
Mhm.
um Also, I let you know that it's okay to tell my secrets,
Mhm.
essentially, in a way, in a
Right. Right.
roundabout way.
Yeah. Mhm.
It might not be like, realistically speaking, you might not have a secret
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
prepared
Usually, by the
every
way,
second.
I like that you say that. That's usually the thing, right? So if you don't set boundaries with people, they're just gonna assume that you don't have a problem.
That's the thing. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then
Mhm.
if somebody's rigid, right? Imagine you're friends with somebody for 3 years
Mhm.
and they show up 10 minutes late to dinner and you cut them off,
Mhm.
right?
Right. Right. Right.
And that's a little extreme. It's very extreme, that example. But being rigid in your boundaries is not great too. You're going to end up, you know, letting a lot of people, like, out of your life for things that maybe especially, like, maybe with your rigid, you do let them know they crossed the boundary,
Mhm.
but once they've crossed that boundary, that's it. Like, they
And
can't
people,
do
by the way,
anything about it.
people do that, man. And I mean, it's
Yeah.
protective in nature if you think about it, right? So it's like if you're already jumping to conclusions and you're like, oh, okay, this person did one wrong thing, right? Therefore, they're going to now do 10 wrong things. And now I'm cutting them out of my life to prevent myself from being hurt. It kind of makes sense as a protective mechanism.
So it
Even
definitely
though it's
makes
poor,
sense.
yeah, even though it's poor reasoning, because you can't predict from somebody being like 10 minutes late or whatever that, they're gonna fuck you over somewhere down the line. But yeah, man, people actually sometimes think that way, where it's like, oh, by the way, so this happens a lot with dating, with like let's say with let's kind of, I mean, this happens with, gay couples too, but let's just, for the sake of simplicity, let's use a
Sure.
straight one, right? So you would have a woman say something like, oh, well, this guy is just trying to get laid, so I'm not going to talk to him anymore. And I'm like, okay, but how do you know that? How do you know he's only trying to get laid? And she'll say, well, like we talk and we have nice conversations, but then it becomes sexual. And I'm like, oh, well, you set the boundary with him, right? You said, hey, I'm not interested in this. So, we can either continue, in a less kind of sexual way, or where we cut this off, right? And it's like, no. It's like, okay, so you didn't set the boundary with him. So wait, what are you then thinking? Well, if it's sexual, then that means that's all he wants. I'm like, that's not true. I'm like, people want intimacy and sex at the same time. So if you're not ready for it, right, you can say, hey, I'm not ready for it. And if you keep talking about it, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. That makes a ton of sense, right? But I'm like, but what you're doing is, it seems like you're kind of cutting this guy off, even though, I mean, he's a human being. He's going to want sex. If you're saying that the only thing he wants is sex, I'd be like, what's the proof, right? How do you know? And then if the person says, well, all he talks about is sex, and I'd say, okay, let's take what you're saying for granted, and fine. If all he talks about is sex, I understand. But a lot of times, man, people kind of put people again in these categories based on like black and white thinking, where it's like, I can make a prediction based on this person's behavior, even though you actually can't. People are way too complicated for that.
So yeah, that's the thing. So a lot of people want to be told what their boundaries are,
Right.
essentially. Like they,
Or they want you to know what their boundaries are.
yeah, they just want to, they expect you to know
Yeah.
and do the boundaries for
Yeah.
them and all
Right.
that. And so in that particular case, it's almost as if, whether it's conscious or not, she's expecting the guy to, the one that's good for her is somebody who's perfect, who
Yes.
perfectly
Who already knows.
accidentally
Yeah. By the way,
goes,
if you
yeah.
ever seen The Purple Rose of Cairo, it's this really old movie from, like, well, not really old, but whatever. It's 1985. It's a Woody Allen movie. So it's really cool because it's with Jeff Daniels, and the guy plays two people, right? So he plays the actor and he plays the actual character on the movie screen, right? And so the character on the movie screen ends up like coming into the real world, and like all of the women fall in love with him, right? They're like, oh my God, like this is it. He's the man that we've all been waiting for, right? So all of them fall in love with him, right? And one of the so Mia Farrow was in it, and she ends up falling in love with the actual actor, right? And the actor is a huge scumbag. So it's so funny, right? And like all of the women are like, yo, like, oh my God, like, no, this guy's amazing. And then here's Mia Farrow, and she's like chasing around the actual actor, right? And then of course the actor does what most men do, right? Or you would think, I guess. So the actor ends up dumping her, and he's like, hey, sorry, I found some. Oh no, he didn't find someone else. He got some sort of offer to go back to Hollywood, and he's like, hey, yeah, so my career restarted. Thanks, this was nice, but sorry, bye, right? And she's like devastated by this, right? And then like the other women essentially learn that this ideal like character doesn't actually and will never exist, and they're like, where are the men like you? Can you send us some back? And he's like, because he's like in the film or whatever, so he's because he's like a fantasy, right? He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, all men are like this. And they're like, no, all men are not like this, because he's like chivalrous and brave and sort of gallant, right? But yeah, the point of the story is that like those ideals that people have, men and women, you're never going to find that in real life.
Yeah, and just expecting somebody to be psychic,
Yeah.
right? It's also, it's like a foolhardy thing,
Yeah.
it's better to sort of just let somebody know what you're okay with, what you're not
Right.
okay with, and you'd be so pleasantly surprised. And then even if it does lead to that person not being in your life,
Yeah.
kind of back to what we said again before, that just means good. It's somebody who's not aligned with your values,
Yeah. And by
essentially.
the and I also find that, going back to the conversation about dating, that the women who do cut guys off because they think they already know what these guys want, it's because they're afraid of confrontation. So rather than say like, hey, I want to set this boundary with you, I'm not okay with talking about sex right now, I just rather ghost you, because like, oh, I already know what you want, right? So it's like, why even, well, it's like, they talk themselves out of having that difficult conversation. So instead of saying like, okay, maybe he's only interested in sex, or maybe not, but I can't really know until I have a conversation with him, it's like, no, I already know. We're done. I'm done with him. I'm never talking to him again. And it's all literally because you just were too afraid to set the boundary.
Yeah. And also this goes for guys as well, right? So maybe you're not afraid to say what's okay and what's not okay in a conversation,
Right.
generally speaking, but maybe somebody could be afraid to say, I don't think it's good that, you're, so I think this is, by the way, a nuanced thing. This is not reflective of my own thoughts. It's just
Yep.
something you see generally, which is like, hey, I'm not okay with you hanging out with this other guy like for hours, and I don't know what you guys are doing. and
And you
it's
say
fine.
he's just a friend.
Yeah. And or like I don't think it's okay for you and a guy alone to go like do this activity together if we're in a relationship and all of that. It's kind of reads funny. And then that could be like a discussion. But sometimes somebody might be quiet around that and be like, well, listen, I don't want her to judge me and think that I'm a jealous person, because I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm jealous. I just don't, just from a practical standpoint, like, hey, it's probably not a good idea. Somebody might have that mindset. Not a lot of people do. Some people might be just jealous, and that's what you're
Yeah.
generally going to encounter. But imagine, yeah, there's that person who's just like, no, they're pretty centered, but they don't want to. They read too many psychology books. Like they don't want to look like they're afraid, and being afraid to lose your status makes you look like someone who has less status, and your attraction is not static, it's always changing in the moment. So you don't want to make even one mistake, because then the moment you make one mistake, if that guy's energy over there or state or whatever or status is this much higher at the moment when this much higher when yours is like this much lower, that's it, you're out, you're
Right,
done. And some people are paranoid and think like that.
right.
A little specific of an example there at the end, but you kind of get my thing. There's also people who do silent treatment. Like,
Yes, that's a big one.
yeah, it's like you might say like, no, what's wrong? No, nothing. No, seriously. Like, can you tell me what's going on? No. And then they don't get into it. Nothing gets defined clearly. Creates this like tension, this hum of tension, which then just seeps into the relationship. It's like a toxic dynamic, right? As opposed to, imagine this other world where you expressed what you felt, right? And you let them know, then they're less likely to do that. Like it's actually, that's why I kind of stick to that perspective of like, sometimes I think the other person is literally almost like me in another body, in a sense. Not always, but generally speaking. And I'd be like, if you just knew what you were doing, it'd be okay. But a lot of people don't know what they do. I'm not religious or anything like that, but there's like this Jesus quote, like, forgive them for they know not what they do. For some reason that came up to mind, right? Like, if they don't know what they do, once they know what they do, if they do it again, it's not a habit, or it's not like a thing they automatically do. It's like a choice, right? So then that's where like whether they're going to follow your boundaries or not, and then you can make a decision on them. Yeah, I don't know. Like, do you have any times where like you haven't expressed a boundary and things didn't go quite well?
Yes. Oh my God. Okay. So not to mention anything specifically, but I
Sure.
used to do this and I learned my lesson the hard way. So, I mean, I did this up until recently too. So when I get a new client, I actually don't tend to give people contracts because I like give them the benefit of the doubt, which is most of the time, like 90% of the time, it's a good move. Right. But sometimes if you tell them, as you'll say, hey, like this is my cancellation policy, right? People don't care, right? And they forget. So they're not going to remember what you told them, right? And then you tell them like, hey, remember, like this was my cancellation policy. And they'd be like, oh, that's what it was. Can we just like overlook it? And I'd be like, okay, like now I have, to figure out what to do here. So what I started doing was like with some people, I actually like send out contracts and I'm like, hey man, here's my cancellation policy, right? I'm like, if you forget it one time, I might overlook it, right? But now what I started doing with pretty much the vast, maybe not the majority, but I do it with some of my new clients, and I do it with so I do it. No, I don't even do it with new clients. I mean, maybe I should, but I do it with people who like are sort of like, you can tell already on the cusp of like, taking too many, to canceling too many sessions. So what I'll do is I'll send them a contract and I'll tell them like, please sign the contract, right? And I'll say like, hey, if you want to continue therapy, I need you to know that this is the cancellation policy. If you want to leave, you can leave anytime you want, but if you're going to stay, these are the rules, right? So, and it's my fault too, because initially what I would do is, even though I would set the boundary, honestly, I should get it in writing because, people do tend to forget. So that's on me. So I kind of set the boundary very poorly, whereas honestly, I should probably send out the contract to everybody. I still don't do that because, again, 90% of the time it doesn't go badly. So it's not that big of a deal. But like when it does, it becomes an issue, and then you have to get it in writing. And now I'm just like, you know what? I don't even care that I didn't write it down. I told you, right? If you needed to remember, you could have written it down. But yeah, so what I do with some folks, not everybody, is I do send them contracts.
Yeah,
So
so
I learned
that's
my,
fair.
yeah,
It
so
sounds like an adapt. Well, you
yeah,
adapted.
I had to learn my lesson. But yeah, so normally what I like to do is I don't like to, kind of rock the boat because it's business. You understand. You don't want to lose people. And then on top of, yeah, like you don't want to lose people. Then on top of that, like some people are already kind of fragile, and you're like, you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but you have to, right? So one of the best things I've ever learned was something that came secondhand to me was so my friend Elaine, she told me, she's like, my dad said that like when we were younger, and she's like, it's bad business keeping toxic people in your kind of sphere, right? So she's like, she said something along the lines of like, you're better off getting rid of like bad, partners or bad customers or whatever it is, right? In the short term, I'm sorry, in the long term, as opposed to the short term. So even though you're losing money, it doesn't matter, right? Even if you have to like go without, like even if you're not getting paid for that chunk for whatever amount of time, in the long run, it's going to save you a whole lot of heartache. And that's what I figured out with clients too, a lot of times, that some people, and this is a business, right? That's the thing I think a lot of therapists don't want to talk about. It's like, not to get into this too much because it's not the point of the show, but honestly, it's important, I think, that a lot of therapists don't like to treat their practices as businesses, and they are fucking businesses. So because it's a business, right? Some people are going to be too severely like, ill or disturbed or whatever to be a part of business. And that's it. You can send them off to clinics. You could send them off to like inpatient, houses or whatever. That's fine, right? But the thing is, because you're running a business, you have to also treat it as such, meaning that sometimes when people like, they kind of, they step over your boundaries, you have to like call them out on and be like, hey, we're not doing this anymore. And by the way, man, the thing that I hate the most is when somebody violates my boundary and they'll say thank you in advance. I'm like, oh my God. And so like literally this person will
Like they're
know that
assuming you're gonna do
yeah,
this.
they're
Yeah.
assuming I'm going to do it, right? So it's like, I know you have this boundary, but my excuse is so good that not only do I assume that you're going to do it, right? But I'm also thanking you in advance because I'm trying to make you feel guilty for not wanting to do it, right? So it's like the whole thank you in advance, because, when somebody says thank you to you, right? You start to feel guilty. You're like, oh man, like, wow, like shit, like this person is grateful that I'm doing this thing for him, but I'm not going to do it. I don't want to do it. There's something wrong with me, right? So it's like expressing gratitude, like pacifies people, right? Again, guilt, right? It makes them feel guilty for not giving in. So I hate that so much. When a person tells me thank you in advance, automatically I'm like, I'm not doing this thing. Yep.
Yeah, I'm with it. Yeah, why not? Listen,
Yeah.
they're they're thinking. I mean, in a way, you can argue they're thinking like, "Oh, you're definitely going to do this thing I'm requesting,"
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
and
So
like I could definitely violate your
yeah.
boundary, right? Like
Yeah.
from
So
that perspective.
yeah, so the idea here is that my reason is so good that you can't say no. Like this is, you can't refuse it, right? So I know what your rules are, right? However, right, my reasoning for bending them is so good, and I'm special in this case, right? I'm special, therefore you need to give this to me, right? It just only makes sense. It's only rational. And so, going back to kind of business advice, right? And this is something that Jeff Jarrett has said that his dad said, right? So he's like, in professional wrestling, you have like, selfish people, obviously, because I mean, it's a business of like individual athletes, right? So he's like, getting rid of a selfish person is like the hardest thing to do if you keep them around for too long. So he's like, what happens, unfortunately, a lot of the times, he's like, we feel really bad for people, we don't want to take away their livelihoods. And so we just won't get rid of them, right? And they become like fucking cancers in our locker rooms, right? And he's like, look, nothing, no mistake is there's no mistake that's unfixable, right? However, he's like, the longer you keep around this like selfish person, it's just the harder it's going to be to remedy it, right? Meaning that pretty much like probably the longer of a contract he has, the more like intertwined he is with the storyline, meaning it's hard to like, like untangle him from like the web, right? So, but the point is, he's saying that like, yeah, man, he's like, you really got to get rid of some of these like truly selfish people early because they're going to corrupt the entire thing, right? And by the way, this even sometimes happens with therapy. So what you'll have is you'll have like, and this is very rare, but you'll have like a client who takes up so much of your time that you can't treat other people, right? You're just so kind of enmeshed in this relationship where even if you set boundaries, they just continuously violate them and violate them. So they'll email you, they'll call you, right? Whatever it is, right? Because they want your attention. And so, but you have like 10 other people you're seeing that day, right? So in that respect, you would have to refer the person out. So it's like, it's one of those things that people don't like to talk about because, we try to be martyrs and saviors and we're like, no, you have to like treat everybody. And, it's wrong, like to turn people down. Actually, it's not, man. Some people are just so like far gone and so mentally ill that you have to refer them to clinics or again, inpatient units, whatever it is, because again, they're gonna I don't want to say poison the well, but they're going to make life just incredibly hard for you and the other people that you're treating. And again, this is a business, so this is how it works. And I mean, look, people might not like this perspective, but this is just a part of life.
No, listen, I think it's fair, right? I mean, I know you didn't want to use the expression "poison the well,"
Yeah.
but
No, because you get it.
right,
Like these
it
people
could
are
seep into
struggling,
the other
right?
aspect. Like,
Right.
yeah, if you allow this, look, it's not to insult anyone, but if somebody's being quote unquote toxic, right?
Right.
And they're around you, they're it's like seeping into you, like it's too much. It's like it's a lot going on there.
Yeah, meaning
You have
that you
other
can't
people you need
manage
to,
it. Yeah, yeah, meaning
yeah.
that you've tried your best, you've been as compassionate and as assertive as possible, and it's still not going nowhere, anywhere, right? So, and I'm not saying again that's very rare. Like these are very rare cases, but when it does happen, right, it does happen. Meaning that you can say a million and one things, and you can say it as perfectly as you want. That person will still not give a shit that you set a boundary with them.
So I think then essentially, the kind of boundary that you're talking about is healthy, right? Because what I'm
Yeah,
getting from listening to you, right, is that, I mean, if somebody has a legitimately good reason, forgetting the thank you ahead of time thing, that barring that example, it sounds like maybe sometimes like you'll let it go. It depends on what it is, and then
yeah.
other times it's like, all right, no, no, I'm not letting
Yeah,
this through.
here
Yeah.
I'll even give you an example, right? So here's what my cancellation policy is, right? So imagine you tell me like, hey, I'm going on vacation. So I have one per 30 days, right? So imagine you tell me like, hey man, I'm going on vacation on the 20th, right? And I'm like, oh, okay, cool, that makes sense, right? And then imagine you get sick, right? And you're like, oh my God, like yo, I'm so sorry, I don't know what to do. I got sick. I would not hold that against you. I'd be like, yeah, that's fine. That's literally an act of God or whatever. No worries, right? You got sick. I get it. This vacation was already planned. I'm not going to give you a hard time about that. However, if you cancel a session for no reason, which has been done, and then you get sick after that, like literally imagine like the day of, you're like, oh, hey, I got to cancel, right? I don't want to, and I'm like, oh, how come? What's going on? And you're like, can we just move? You're not even giving me a reason, right? Can we just like reschedule for next week? Okay. But remember, this is your one, right? Do we remember that? This is your one. And the person will say, yes, I do know that this is my one. Okay. And then literally they get sick somewhere down the line. I will even tell them like, you know what, let's try to even reschedule that. And if then they tell me no, I can't even reschedule like where I got sick, I'd be like, no, we're done, we're not playing this game.
Oh, yeah, that's fair. Like, what can you do? Because if they keep canceling and that time that you set aside,
Yeah, because
is
yeah,
not being occupied.
my thing
Yeah.
is like, look, I'm already doing you a favor because like, so if you were sick, I would let you, we could just cancel the session, right? But I told you, I said, hey, that session before you said, I know I said, this is it. This is your one for the month. And you agreed. You're like, okay, I understand. I'll see you next time, right? So what I'm doing is because you were sick, I'm telling you, hey, let's reschedule for the later part of the week, right? Because I'm trying to keep you on board, right? I'm trying not to just kick you out. But then if you tell me, oh, hey, I'm busy during the week, or I have which has happened to me before, where somebody would say, oh, hey, I have plans during the week, I can't make it. Sorry, I guess we're done with therapy then.
Yeah. Look, here's the thing. There's times where you have to be stern as well, right? You can't have somebody taking advantage, right?
Right.
There's these other resource, like the time resource that is being missed by this person who keeps violating
Right.
your agreement with them. Um, that time could be used to help somebody else, right?
Right.
And so you have to weigh out everything. Also, it's a business, so you also have to
Yeah.
make money. You can't just rely on a late fee or this or that.
Yeah.
There's also just like, how much does this person take seriously the therapy? Like, I'll get
Right.
somebody else who takes it seriously then,
Mhm.
right? And there's
And a
all
lot
these
of
different
times,
factors. Yeah.
and a lot of times, man, because people are super nice, like most people aren't aggressive, right? So everything is done in a very sort of politically correct way. They just expect it, as long as you're nice, right, you can get what you want. And I think a lot of times people have learned that about the world. Like, so some people are like, okay, if I'm a bully, I'll get my way, right? But for some people, it's like, no, no, no. If I'm just like a people pleaser, then I'll get my way, right? If I just like flatter you and I tell you how great therapy is and how amazing you are and how truly sorry I am, for having to miss so many sessions, they think like, oh, they could kind of like let's say finagle their way into getting you to make a decision that works for them, right? But no, no, I don't care how flattering you are, and I don't care how like grateful and thankful you are. The rules are the rules. If you don't have a legitimately good excuse for missing the session, again, if you plan the vacation months in the, or even a month in advance, I totally get it. But like you just taking a day off just to take a day off. I'm like, you could do that, but now you're taking a risk, right? Now the risk is like, oh shit, I can't miss any more sessions, because if I do, I'm out of here. He took that risk, or she took that risk, or whoever it is, they took the risk.
Yeah. And plus, you have a system set up that allows for them, like at least
Right.
once, to just miss it. Or if they happen to have a good excuse, okay, then you could reschedule or this or that.
Yeah.
There's leniency
Yeah.
in
And
your
by the way,
system.
and I try my best to reschedule people, especially like now with telehealth. Like I will tell them like, hey man, like I will, like it's not going to be every day, obviously, because I'm like busy, but I'll try my best, right? And I'll be like, look, you have to work with me on this. Meaning, I'll give you probably several time slots that we can reschedule, but you're going to have to be flexible too, right? And some people are like, oh, I can't do that. I have like dates or whatever. Some people legitimately tell you that. They're like, oh, I have plans. And I'm like, I don't care that you have plans. I'm like, because you already took your absence as an adult, maybe you should cancel one of those plans and use one of
Yeah.
those sessions, or use one of those time slots for therapy. Oh, but I don't want to do that because maybe I'm going on a date or whatever. Well, I'm sorry, man. I hope you enjoy your date.
And he's like, but this date is therapy for me. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. No, and
But
that's cool. And that's my
yeah.
thing. Look, man, I'm cool with that, right? I just, my whole thing is like, if you're done with therapy, you can tell me you're done with therapy. We don't have to go through this. If you feel like other things are a priority to you, you are an adult. You can walk away whenever you want. Just please let me know. Don't play this game of like, oh, I want to have my cake and eat it too. That's the thing that bothers me.
Yeah. And also, let's say in terms of time as well, just to add a little bit here, let's say you tell someone, I have a hard out, like
Yeah.
at 1:35, I have a hard out. I'm going to be, I have to go. I seriously
Yeah.
have to go. And even if they show up late, 15 minutes, you're like, no, 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 it's still going to be until 1:35.
Yeah.
And then the moment 1:35 hits, like, thank you for your time. Bye. And that's it.
Yep.
Like, for example, there's things like that too, right? Or if you, yeah, just like, again, the importance of having boundaries is that, again, it's a demonstration of value and self-respect, right?
Yeah.
And people will really, really appreciate that when somebody is definitely someone who is demonstrates like a sort of higher value and things of that nature. Sure, sometimes it's going to polarize somebody out of your life, but again, it might polarize someone who shouldn't necessarily interact with you so much. Then, if they're going to be extremely rude, cross your boundaries all the time, violate your trust, break or damage one of your belongings, interrupt you constant. Oh yeah, even somebody being interrupted all the time, like maybe that's fine sometimes, but if it's too much and you can't actually get words in edgewise, maybe you have to set a boundary and be like, hey man, let me talk, instead of just letting them go, because then you lose your thread. Maybe you had something important to say and it doesn't get said, and then this person is interrupting you, creates this resentment in you. And by the way, I know there's a lot of things that we keep sort of revisiting, but it's definitely important to hammer in. And oh yeah, right. So I might have said this before, but why it's important to sort of, like, even I'm going to do this after this podcast. I was doing it even a little bit before this podcast. I hope that like people listening to this will take the time to do this too, because there's a lot of things that we talk about here in the show that, like, it's great to listen to. You may feel like a little bit enhanced by listening to it. Maybe you understand now that, there's all these different kinds of boundaries. And actually, if I have a clear set of boundaries, even for myself and for others, it's actually going to be a net positive for my life. And there's so many great things about it. And so many symptoms and effects. And somebody could take that sort of value, and that's fantastic. But I feel like the next level of that would be to really do a sort of self-audit, right? Like where in my life, even in the past, let's say in a past relationship, where have you not been clear with your boundaries? Where have you not spoken up where you should have? Where have you been too rigid? Where did you tell someone, you told somebody, no, you cut them out, but you actually maybe could have listened to them. Right. Maybe they actually had something to say that, and you didn't understand a perspective that you could have understood, and something like that. Where are you now? Not setting boundaries. Maybe there's something you should be working on, and you're sort of going by how you feel, and you're not setting the time to be like, do this thing, right? Whether it's schoolwork for somebody listening, whether it's maybe you told yourself, I'm gonna read this book, and you've been saying that already for a month,
Mhm.
and you haven't been doing it, right? Maybe you set sort of a boundary with yourself, like, I'm gonna, do the things that I say I'm gonna do. I mean, that's a little general, but sort
But
of,
by the way, how about even
yeah,
adding this? Maybe love yourself enough to do the things that you want to do, and that you tell yourself you're going to do, like fucking work out, right? Because
yeah.
kind of, yeah. I was going to say feed yourself, but I mean that metaphorically, right? Like, kind of feed your soul, man. Like, you are worth learning, and you are worth sort of taking care of emotionally, physically, right? But yeah, people a lot of times don't feel like not only do they, it's not that they want, don't, I mean, they don't want to do it, but they don't even feel like they deserve like the time and care that they should give to themselves, like that should be given to others.
I wish I could really verbalize like the how many benefits really come out of knowing what your boundaries are and letting people know what they are. Like, you don't have to expressly let somebody know, like, you have crossed my boundary. Leon, you crossed my boundary right there. But it doesn't have to be so overt. But sometimes even I don't know if how much you would agree with this, but I feel like sometimes even it's in your visual, like your physical cues.
Right.
Like, sometimes you could even let somebody know just by looking at them a certain way when they said something like, "Oh, that wasn't okay." Like, you don't have to necessarily overtly say it. Like, why I give an example like this is maybe somebody's listening
Mhm.
and then they take it too literally. Like, you don't want to take advice too like black and white,
Right.
but yeah, doing a self audit would be important.
Mhm.
Really clearly defining, like, what are your boundaries, what are your emotional boundaries, what are your physical boundaries, what are your material boundaries, what's your time boundaries.
Mhm.
Getting that sort of what sort of things do you expect from your relationships,
Yep.
things like that. And then once you actually have something like that clearly defined, you're no longer subject, or you're less, definitely some percentage wise, less subject to just, again, my favorite phrase, the automaticity of things, right?
Mhm. Yep.
Because then you know that when you encounter this thing, because you've thought it through, this is my boundary, and you may either intuitively somehow show that somebody's crossing it, or
Yep.
show that this is a boundary. You may verbalize it, and it definitely would improve my relationships by me letting people know what's okay and what's not okay, knowing when to also let something go through, right? Like, I had a big thing with jokes before.
Mhm.
I Once upon a time I used to take jokes like very literally, like
Yes,
very.
I do remember those days.
By the way, even when we met,
It was not that bad.
it was
Yeah.
less than what it
Okay.
used to be before that.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's,
Mhm.
yeah, it's been years of improvement with that. But
I hear
then
you.
that's why I love comedy, right?
Mhm.
um because, yeah, a lot of things that sound like they're literal are actually jokes.
Mhm.
And once you can actually appreciate that it's not literal, you can laugh at almost anything in life. But
Right. Right.
that's probably a different episode, maybe on comedy or something,
Most
or the
definitely.
arts, let's say.
All
But
right, man.
yeah, yeah.
So, what do we think are the big takeaways from today?
So definitely knowing the value of having boundaries, that it's
Yep.
tied with your self-worth and self-respect and
Mhm.
value, and that having them is important. Not being wishy-washy, kind of
Mhm.
clearly defining what your boundaries are is important.
Yep.
Because if you don't clearly define what your boundaries are, you're going to be like we gave the example at the very beginning. Like, I don't know when I should be relaxing, when I should be working. Like,
Mhm.
I feel like I should be working when I'm relaxing when I'm working.
Right. Right.
Things like that as an example.
Yep.
Um, Knowing what you allow from yourself and from others,
Mhm.
and trying to define that as best as possible.
Yep.
And
I would
I
even
think
add
that's
to
essentially, yeah.
Yeah, well, I would even add to that, like even for like, our listeners, obviously, maybe even give yourself the chance to be with somebody or talk to somebody or try to form a relationship with somebody who actually acknowledges and accepts your boundaries, right, as valid. So maybe you'll kind of surprise yourself and you'll see that there are people out there who, like, you're good enough for, and these people are, who will respect you in turn as you respect them, right? So it's like a lot of times, again, people, what they do is they don't give themselves a chance to form healthy relationships because they're fucking scary. And I get it. I mean, obviously. But the point is that when you don't take that risk and you don't give yourself a chance, the thing that you're putting yourself into, right, it's already predictably toxic. And there's really no way out as long as you're going to keep yourself in it. It's sort of like quicksand.
100%. And last thing I would say is also just, again, recognizing where are your boundaries. Like do an audit. Where are my boundaries rigid and where are they loose?
Yeah.
And also if you have any healthy ones, that's great. Then, of course, pat on the back. That's great if if you're kind of halfway in, halfway out with that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And also stop canceling sessions with your therapist because you have a date. It's not a valid excuse.
It's not cool, no matter how hot she is or how hot he is.
Yeah. Your therapist ain't gonna care.
Yeah, even if you send pictures to your therapist, even if you send videos to your therapist, it's not an excuse. And don't ever say thank you ahead of time with any of your
my God,
therapists.
please. I hope that's the number one takeaway. Stop using the term thank you in advance. Let the person decide whether or not they're going to do that thing for you.
Yeah. All right, then I guess let's end it there.
Yep.
Guys, if you want to follow us, you could follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe, hit the bell. And thank you so much for watching. See you next time.